Chapter 32, Chapter 32. The Men Who Strive with Gods. The name stuck in Ash's ears, ringing like a bell in the distance and tuning out the rest of the world for several quieting seconds. No, the young trainer answered after a moment, shaking himself from silence and folding his arms in front of his chest. Never heard of it. He shook his head again. Walk with me. Giovanni clasped his hands behind his back and turned away, walking for the stairwell. Uncertainty and piqued curiosity playing across his features, Ash sighed and followed after the man in the suit. The dim halls grew steadily lighter as the trainers left the core of the cavernous gym behind and made their way into the facility's extremities where barred windows and skylights overtook sparingly placed lamps. It's the thing of legends, Giovanni said as Ash stepped up beside him, the Sun Soul. It's a tiny fragment of a world long past, a relic left over from the time when living forces of nature, beings like but far greater than Zapdos or its kin were still busy shaping our world. Why do I get the feeling that you're about to tell me a crazy-sounding story? Ash muttered, his tone stuck somewhere between fascination and sarcasm. More than a story, Giovanni said, stopping in the hallway, the morning light from one of the windows falling over his back and shading his face. History. He trailed off and turned around, setting his hands on the stone windowsill and looking out over the plains before the gym. History that slowly faded from the minds of man until it was forgotten. I don't know if you remember when your mother and I would read to you. Giovanni looked over his shoulder at Ash. You were probably too little to understand the stories, but your favorites were always the creation myths from Hoenn and Sinnoh. Do you remember? Ash walked to the window beside Giovanni and watched as the sun rose halfway above the horizon. Vaguely, he said. A bunch of huge Pokémon made the world out of earth, water, and air, right? That's the Hoenn myth, Giovanni nodded. Remember the one from Sinnoh? Staring out the window, Ash focused for a second, then shook his head. No, he said. What do old stories have to do with what? He paused and selected his words. You and I are working towards everything, his father muttered. Why? Ash probed. They're the explanation for it all, Giovanni went on. The myths. They tell us how the world began and, to a large extent, how it will end. Ash raised an eyebrow. Really? His retort died, half-formed. Go on then. Ages ago, Giovanni refocused on the world outside the gym. When humans had only just finished taking their first steps across the plains, the world was a far less threatening place. Pokémon as we know them didn't exist and instead there were only unintelligent beasts that lived in herds or hunted in packs. By comparison to today's Pokémon, they were weak, lacking any weapons beyond teeth and claws powered by muscles not many orders of magnitude stronger than a normal human's. Nature was ripe for the picking. Humans, armed with the intellect unlike anything nature had ever produced, were poised to take over, and in a flash we did. Many generations passed before man truly mastered his environment and built the first civilizations, domesticating the animals and the land itself, creating wonders of technology that made what we have today look primitive by comparison. I'm not sure how long we ruled, but enough time passed that whole civilizations encompassing the world rose and fell. Giovanni paused. But then something changed. Ash cleared his throat when his father failed to return from trailing off. What happened? He asked. Looking out over the torn landscape at the mass grave prepared by Dragon Company soldiers, Giovanni blinked. Records and technology from before the change are difficult but not impossible to find. Scattered in forgotten places all across every region to which I sent archaeologists, glyphs and old tablets in the ruins of underground fortresses tell of a civilization of humans that rose to conquer the world with almost magical technology, only to be thrown down when some unnamed creature came from beyond the edge of the world. The monster demanded submission from, and veneration by, mankind. When the equally arrogant humans declined, the monster spawned what the records only call the creators. Beings capable of sundering space and time with their very presence, to destroy everyone who wouldn't submit. The details are sketchy, but humans woke up, or created, or otherwise sided with three creatures of their own, monsters who could supposedly raise entire continents out of the ocean, call enormous tsunamis, and cause all kinds of havoc. Giovanni slowly moved his hands as he spoke. The resulting battles between humans and their allies and the creators and their master drew the attention of other alien entities, legendary monsters of which Zapdos was one, who found themselves caught up in the scuffle and trapped on our little world. After it was all said and done, the world had changed. Whole countries were gone and entire continents had been wiped out by the conflict.
The Creator's master had vanished, along with his creations, but the world they left behind was one fraught with creatures twisted by the warpings of reality caused by the Creators. Modern Pokémon had arrived, a small legacy of the war that changed the face of our whole planet, and what's more, without an epic adversary to fight, humanity's colossal allies turned on each other. The Guardians began fighting and destroying the world all over again, all while humanity was left fractured and without the greater part of their technology, most of which had been destroyed in the war.
His lip twisting downward, Ash shook his head a little.
Then why are we still here?
He asked.
Because we evolved,
Giovanni stated flatly, though his somber tone did little to hide the excitement in his eyes.
The rampage of the Creators did more than turn ungifted animals into flying and fire-breathing Pokémon. Humans were changed too. Our cunning and our collective conqueror's spirit grew just as much if not more than the natural abilities of the Pokémon in the world. So much so in fact, that it didn't take us long to subjugate the new monsters of the world through force of will alone, and using new servants like Charizards and equally fearsome monsters, we drove the old Guardians so far from what few settled regions remained that they ultimately passed into legend. And this has what to do with the Sun Soul?
Ash asked.
Everything,
Giovanni answered.
When the Creator's master retreated, it abandoned the fortress it had built in the north, in Sinnoh, in the deepest vault of which lay a treasure that went undiscovered until not too long ago. The Sun Soul is that treasure,
Ash stated, waiting as Giovanni nodded curtly.
But what is it?
He pressed.
In form,
Giovanni began,
it's a tiny jewel, more like a grain of sand, that glows with all the intensity of the sun. In essence, it's the distilled power of the Creators and their master, a tiny fraction of their abilities given physical form. Neither of those are particularly important questions though.
The man in the suit grinned.
Not now, there are two much more pertinent questions that you've been wanting to ask since this conversation started, aren't there?
Ash paused for a long second, then looked up and out the window.
What does it do? It grants its possessor whatever he wants, either in the form of a heightening of his natural abilities over a long period of time or, so I've been led to understand, by granting the owner a single wish. Any wish, a free ticket at rewriting one aspect of reality, after which the power will be exhausted and the Sun Soul reduced to a worthless rock. And the second question?
His eyes narrowing as his brain worked over the implications, Ash let a grin slip across his lips.
Without bringing up how insane this all sounds and asking if you're off your meds. How do we get it? Well,
Giovanni sighed,
that's the hard part.
Ash shook his head a little.
Of course it is. The man who discovered the Sun Soul in the first place was an individual by the name of Furs Rex. The first king of Lavender.
Ash interrupted.
The one and only,
affirmed the man in the suit.
3 centuries ago, Furs was a little-known warlord in the north. The story goes that, while lost in a blizzard he found the Creator's tower and, upon raiding the unguarded vault, discovered what would become the source of his power. Possessing a few psychic Pokémon of some skill, Furs quickly learned of the gem's power and tried to use the Sun Soul to wish for an unstoppable army. The hitch was that the gem, while all too quick to enhance his natural leadership abilities, didn't grant him the promised wish.
Ash looked over and raised an eyebrow.
Why not? As Furs understood it,
Giovanni went on,
he wasn't pure enough. So, he instead used the Sun Soul's lesser power to carve out the Empire of Lavender. Wait,
Ash broke in, turning and leaning against the stone windowsill.
What do you mean by pure enough? What would I have to be to get a wish? That's the fascinating part,
Giovanni grinned.
My theory is that the Sun Soul still recognized itself as part of the Creator's master and as such would only respond to someone, or something, that bore some semblance of its former master. That's where people like you and I come in.
Ash stared at his father for a second as Giovanni let the younger trainer think it over.
Some people were changed more than others by the old Creators, weren't they?
Ash said.
Or should I say we? Clever boy,
said Giovanni.
I spent 20 years putting all these pieces together. I'm glad you arrived at the same conclusion I did. Professor Oak and his peers thought that savants were the handiwork of generations spent around Pokémon, allowing us to better understand and control them. More accurately, I think, savants are the descendants of the people most changed by contact with the Creators. Spending generations around Pokémon, the other result of the Creators, just brings out more of our nature. That,
Ash started to mutter.
I can't really decide whether that makes sense or not.
He shook his head.
Never mind, remind me again why the Sun Soul will be hard to get. Simply put,
Giovanni shrugged,
Mewtwo has it.
Ash's jaw dropped a little as he cocked his head to one side.
All right.
His tone dropped slowly.
Why? When Furs was nearing the end of his life, he began to fear what would happen if someone who was pure enough found his treasure.
Giovanni crossed his arms.
So, he built an enormous fortress under what's now Cerulean City and locked the Sun Soul away under the protection of a guardian Pokémon. Not Mewtwo if you're wondering. After a few generations the treasure, as Furs hoped, was forgotten, omitted from all records aside from his personal journal. Which you found?
Ash guessed.
30 years ago, yes,
Giovanni nodded.
And ever since, I've been working towards getting my hands on this ultimate treasure, spending every spare moment trying to put myself in a position to learn more about it and gather the means to go after it. And now.
He smiled and looked over at Ash.
You pretty much know the whole story behind your old man's life's work. Serving the Elite Four, founding Team Rocket, all of it's been for this.
He trailed off and cleared his throat.
Hopefully to give you and your mom a better. Let me stop you right there,
Ash interjected. He paused as Giovanni stopped mid-sentence and thought for a second.
Why does Mewtwo have the Sun Soul?
He redirected.
Well,
Giovanni stammered, reaching up and adjusting his tie while looking out the window.
Finding the Sun Soul's location was easy enough. A giant fortress crawling with monsters that ran from Indigo Plateau to Cerulean isn't exactly subtle, but that guardian I mentioned proved a challenge. Eventually I decided that Team Rocket on its own wasn't enough and, playing on his ego some, enlisted Blaine. With Team Rocket's funding Blaine created Mewtwo. A near unstoppable psychic whose only mission was to destroy the guardian at the bottom of the cave and clear the way for Team Rocket. Great,
Ash almost laughed.
And you didn't think he'd turn on you? Of course we did,
Giovanni smirked.
We knew he'd eventually question his existence like any smart monster would, so we grew him with a genetic disorder based on Blaine's work with Huntington's disease that was designed to kill him after a year of activity. As if that weren't enough, we installed tamper-proof ocular nerve flashbangs, ricin packs, and cyanide capsules all on remote triggers to ensure that he could be neutralized at a second's notice. Imagine our surprise when those failsafes went offline and we were still picking up his telesthetic signature more than a year after he failed to return from his mission. You engineered him to die.
Ash blurted, taking several steps away from Giovanni and holding his hands out to his sides.
I can't imagine why he might be a little bitter about that. It's not like...
Ash went on, his tone growing more sarcastic with every word.
He might just be inclined to exact some kind of bloody revenge on the people who created him to do their dirty work and die. You dipshit.
Ash spat, cynicism growing darker as venom seeped into his words.
How could you expect anything less? In Mewtwo's position I think I'd be pissed too. And another thing.
The young trainer began to pace.
Why the hell are you telling me all this? If you're going for the whole fatherly thing, then honesty is great, but you really expect me to respect you after?
He trailed off as Giovanni's features returned to the stony calm he had worn when the two first met.
What are you playing at?
Ash asked, quickly taking on a collected air.
Lance will be in Saffron for the meeting,
Giovanni stated without a hint of emotion.
But I can't be. There will be other gym leaders from Kanto there too and they can't know that I operate under Lance's order. Your average commoner might not have a clue about Team Rocket's real purposes, but many gym leaders and people of power have their suspicions. It would reflect very poorly on the Elite Four if the connections were discovered. And you want me to go in your stead?
Ash guessed, looking away and studying the wall.
You wouldn't have told me all this about Mewtwo if you didn't want me to act as some kind of messenger. Yes and no.
Giovanni reached into his tailored jacket and pulled something from its pocket.
I need you to act as a messenger, yes, but I had planned on telling you anyway. I thought you deserved to know what you were caught up in. Consider it part of my apology for everything.
Ash looked up, searching Giovanni's face for a lie and turning his attention to the small object the older man held out for him.
What's this?
Ash asked, accepting the flower-shaped token and holding it up to the light to examine more closely.
A badge. Viridian's Earth badge.
Giovanni nodded as the translucent green crystal caught the morning light and flickered.
You're one of 2 people I've ever given that to, so if you show it to Lance it will let him know you're speaking directly on my behalf. That's a lot of power to put in the hands of someone who spent the last year trying to bring you down,
Ash muttered, slipping the badge inside his vest.
If we're working together,
answered the man in the suit,
how can I ask you to trust me if I don't show you the same level of faith?
Ash remained silent, dropping his hands into his pockets.
What do you need me to tell him?
He asked a moment later.
Everything I just told you about Mewtwo and his development. Lance needs to be convinced that Mewtwo is not only a threat, but that he's the one orchestrating this whole war. Elm was his puppet. If Lance is at all inclined to believe you, and by extension, me,
Ash crossed his arms.
that shouldn't be too hard. The tricky part is that you need to convince the Elite Four not to attack Mewtwo directly.
Giovanni's face darkened.
Okay.
Ash's tone again grew disbelieving.
Why's that? Mewtwo's an incredibly powerful psychic. If Lance were to storm his lair directly, then the consequences would be most unpleasant. And you don't want to risk him getting his hands on the Sun Soul,
Ash added with a smirk. Shaking his head, Giovanni stepped back.
I'm not worried about that. Lance would never make it to the heart of the lair. Mewtwo would literally cook his mind if he got too close, which is why you need to convince Lance to come here, to Cinnabar, and help against Johto, and the Orange Islands, who are still invading, by the way. Then what are we going to do about Mew?
Ash stopped mid-sentence as Giovanni's face grew even more grave.
Oh, no, no.
Ash shook one finger.
I'm not attacking Malbolge on my own.
Giovanni and Ash both paused as footsteps echoed down the hall. As they grew louder, May, dressed in an orange tank top that fitted barely low enough to reach her black bike shorts, strolled easily from one of the side halls with a massive pack slung over her back and her wet hair still hanging at her shoulders. Spotting Giovanni and Ash, she waved and trotted over to them. Giovanni turned back to Ash as May arrived, bringing the scent of wildflowers with her.
You won't be going alone,
he said. Stepping back that the three trainers could all face each other, he turned to May.
Are you ready to go? Yep,
May chirped, her demeanor glittering.
Good.
The man in the suit turned away while adjusting the peaks of his lapels.
I'll meet the two of you in Indigo. Wait,
Ash called out as Giovanni continued to walk away.
Where do you think you're going? The rookery is that way.
He jerked his thumb over his shoulder.
Indigo,
the man answered, looking back, but continuing on.
It wouldn't be good for us to be seen together until the end. Don't worry. I'll meet you at the entrance and the three of us will tackle Malbolge together.
Ash stopped short as Giovanni disappeared around a corner, then turned to May.
The three of us?
He asked, looking down at the girl and only now noticing that he stood notably taller than her.
What?
May asked, a grin on her lips and a defiant spark in her eye.
Not afraid I'll show you up, are you?
Ash shook his head.
Not where I was going,
he said.
How did?
He again cut himself off.
What did he promise you to get you to help? Several things,
May shrugged, turning and looking out the window.
I'm an heiress, after all. There was a lot of power back in Hoenn to be mine when I grew up, but the fights between Professor Oak and Professor Elm took that away from me.
She stopped and looked up at Ash.
What's rightfully mine was stolen by several local politicians and crime bosses. Giovanni's promised to outfit my journey home and send Team Rocket with me to help me take back what's mine. In return, I cut Team Rocket in on the profits once I regain my family's title and lands. Before that though.
She smiled at him,
I make sure you make it out of Malbolge alive.
Ash sighed.
You realize it's going to be dangerous,
he said.
Mewtwo is a powerful psychic and he's sure to have guards. From what I understand,
May tapped her temple and gestured between herself and Ash.
People like us are immune to psychics and ghosts, so we've got nothing to worry about there. And as for his guards.
She smirked.
We killed Elm. We took down one of the meanest people in the world and lived to tell about it. He had what, like 15 Pokemon? We killed them all and you killed the Red Gyarados.
She exclaimed.
How wicked was that?
Ash looked away and smiled, electing not to tell her that Elm had been softened up by not only Professor Oak, but by Claire as well.
Yeah, he said, yeah, that was pretty awesome. Exactly,
May slapped his arm with surprising force.
So by default you're basically the champion of Kanto now, and it won't be much longer until I'm the queen of Hoenn again and...
She looked off into space, a content air about her.
And?
Ash asked, fighting back a laugh at the dreamy look in the younger girl's eyes.
Oh, I get it.
He went on with a teasing tone when May didn't answer.
The queen is dreaming about her king. Am I right?
Concentration shattering, May's eyes went wide and she whirled on Ash, fists clenched at her sides.
I most certainly am not.
She belted, face turning red.
Oh hey,
Ash answered with a smug grin.
People like us can't hide things from each other, remember? So what's his name?
Turning and looking at the ground, May mumbled something too quiet for Ash to hear.
Sorry,
Ash said, leaning a little closer.
I didn't catch that.
Brawly, she repeated, apple red by now. Thinking for a second, Ash decided he didn't recognize the name.
Well, he'll be lucky to have you. Come on.
He motioned down the hall.
Blaine's probably tired of waiting, and the sooner we take care of Mewtwo, the sooner you can get back to Hoenn. Right, that sounds like a plan,
May nodded, following Ash down the hall and back into the dim interior of the gym before coming to a tall set of winding stairs. Following the stairs higher and higher up, May and Ash made their way back into the cavernous belly of the gym's rookery, where they were immediately met by the gazes of many watchful Pokémon and a few trainers. Blaine, his arms crossed in his white coat, stood at the mouth of the cave, his toes on the very edge of the platform as he surveyed the land. The bald man shook his head and reached up, run one hand over his scalp as the two savants approached behind him.
You're late,
Blaine said, his voice still carrying a hard edge, but almost too quietly to be heard over the constant drone of the wind. As he turned around and the sun flickered off his glasses, the scientist looked at, and then behind Ash and May.
I thought I saw an aerodactyl fly off earlier. Giovanni left already then?
He asked. When Ash nodded, so did Blaine.
That's probably good. Professor,
May said.
Are you alright? You sound.
She paused, tired.
When you spend every night for 2 months wondering if it'll be your last, it can be hard to adjust to a quiet day's rest,
he said.
Especially when you know the work's ending but the danger's barely just begun.
He grumbled something in a language Ash didn't understand, before dropping one hand to the Pokeballs at his belt.
Ready to go.
The last hour and a half of his watch had passed as uneventfully as the first 3, and by the time the sun had begun to emerge from the glow lingering on the horizon, Ash felt more than ready to get up and finish the final leg of his journey to Saffron City. He had spent the pre-dawn hours letting Arcanine's finely tuned ears scan the darkness for danger, while he focused all of his attention on the little orb in his hand. Glinting like an amethyst in the fresh sunlight, the Master Ball sparkled back at Ash as he turned it over in his hand and grinned to himself. Leaning against Arcanine, settled into the canine's warm mane, Ash sighed and tried to concentrate on the orb and not the worry growing more substantial by the minute in the back of his mind. At every turn, his mind seemed to attempt to return to Cinnabar to dwell on Janine's condition. The young gym leader found it harder and harder to redirect his thoughts to matters closer at hand, and eventually gave up altogether. With a shaking breath, he pressed one fist to his lips and silently tried to think if there was anything else he could have done to better her chances, only to come up short.
This isn't Celadon,
he whispered, closing his eyes and patting his closed fist against his forehead. Snapping his attention away to his environment in an instant, Ash grabbed hold of another Pokeball as a sudden chill lanced into his mind. He spotted around the camp in the clearing, looking between May and a lightly snoring Blaine, both wrapped in their bedrolls, and relaxed a little as he recognized the nearing presence.
Find anything?
He whispered to the ghost. Slowly materializing out of nothing, Haunter's nebulous and chain-draped form floated up to Ash. The pulsing crimson eyes were the last shapes to coalesce as the ghost shook its head. Nothing but dirt and dark, the ghost responded before looking at the orb in Ash's hand. Special? T asked.
Oh yeah,
Ash responded, breaking into another grin. He slipped the Master Ball away and straightened up as May began to stir.
That's going to be my trump card against Mewtwo.
Hope it works, whispered the ghost, fading back to invisibility as Arcanine shook off the chill running down his spine. Waiting until May had sat all the way up and stretched, Ash cleared his throat to get her attention.
Morning,
he said.
Sleep well. Like the dead,
May yawned, standing up and beginning to pack up her bedroll without a second's delay.
Did I miss anything?
Ash shook his head.
Nope. A few of Elm's goons swooped in to kill us while we slept, but they went down without too much trouble. Thought I heard something last night,
May smirked.
Keep it down next time. If you would both keep it down,
Blaine grumbled roughly from his spot on the ground,
I'd appreciate it very much.
The old scientist sat up and began packing up his things, warily looking around his surroundings as he did, while Ash stood up and stretched. As the travelers made their final preparations and Arcanine paced around the edge of the camp, watchful but without any sign of anxiety, Haunter floated up to Ash, invisible and silent, prodding the trainer with mental nudges at his attention. Ash responded with a quick glance over his shoulder and a nod when the ghost asked if the trainer had a moment for questions. You are different, said the specter, its usually expressive voice void of anything but caution. Since the battles on the other land. Colder, older, more forceful somehow. Thinking for a second as he finished packing up his bag and securing the drawstrings, Ash stood up and responded that he didn't feel any different.
Fatigued, maybe,
he said under his breath as he turned away from the rest of the group and faced the space where he knew Haunter to be floating.
I don't really feel anything but more tired.
White fire, Haunter whispered, his outline growing visible as he pointed with one elongated finger straight at Ash's forehead. Ash remained perfectly still as the ghost floated closer, barely more visible than a ripple of heat waves. It wasn't there before you killed the other scientist. A crown. Made of white light. She. Haunter pointed to May, wears one also. Instinctively Ash reached up to his forehead, feeling for the object of which the ghost spoke and, finding nothing, turned and glanced at May. Seeing, again, no sign of a crown of fire, he turned back to the ghost who had again become completely invisible.
I don't see them,
Ash whispered. We see differently, Haunter's tone took on a hint of pride and merriment. See what's there beneath skin, bone, blood. Never seen a human with a crown of fire before. Seems too out of place to be unimportant. Thought you would want to know it burned brighter today than yesterday and brighter yesterday than the day before. The ghost's inaudible laughter echoed in the back of Ash's mind and made his skin crawl. Maybe it will burn right out of your head someday.
Enough,
Ash dismissed Haunter with a wave of his hand and shouldered his pack. Blaine turned to Ash and raised an eyebrow.
Enough?
Asked the man in the glasses. Ash stammered.
Enough waiting around. I'm ready to go.
He recovered.
You.
Both nodding, Blaine and May went to their belts and knocked a Pokeball loose. Appearing beside the man in the lab coat, a Charizard nearly twice the length of its trainer, covered from snout to tail in angry scars, dropped to the ground and threw its wings open with a snarl that made Arcanine leap to the ready and dart between Ash and the new Pokémon.
Easy,
Ash patted Arcanine behind his ears, laid back flat with caution as they were, and ran his hands through the massive canine's mane as May released a rotund blue bird from her Pokeball.
You ready for an adventure?
He asked, grabbing Arcanine by the jaw and turning the dog to look at him. The red Pokemon's demeanor immediately lightened and he began pawing at the ground and wildly wagging his tail as Ash scratched his neck and ears. Several minutes later the three trainers lifted off from their spot in the woods, stirring up a small storm of dust as a Charizard, Pidgeot, and Swellow simultaneously jumped for the sky and angled towards the north. Flying in silence for several hours, the three trainers watched the landscape roll by beneath them as morning gradually melted into afternoon. Without breaking for lunch, they flew until the sun began to sink into the mountains on their left before a small speck appeared in the distance. Lit up with neon and spotlights like it had been before Zapdos' escape and shining like a torch on the horizon, Saffron City stretched beneath the three trainers. Within minutes of arrival, Ash spotted Sabrina's gym within the inner circle of the city, and directed both Blaine and May to a safe landing patch on the roof. No sooner had they touched down on the roof and begun to dismount, Ash's armored boots thudding on the concrete floor, than the door to the stairwell on the far side of the building slid open. Arrayed in a suit the color of mahogany, Sabrina stepped onto the roof and spotted the three other trainers. With a welcoming smile, she paced across the distance between them and stopped next to Ash as he returned Pidgeot to her Pokeball. Extending her hand, she shook his.
The armor came in handy, I see,
the psychic noted the scratches etched into the helmet and breastplate. Ash nodded and gestured to the helmet's cheek where the outer layer of fiberglass had deformed slightly in the face of extreme heat.
I'd say it did its job. Oh.
He stopped and turned, opening his hand towards his companions.
Sabrina, this is May, and I'm sure you know Blaine. Indeed,
the psychic inclined her head politely, though a pang of shock contorted her normally strikingly even features when she laid eyes on May.
It's a pleasure to meet you,
she said to the wide-eyed girl, recovering quickly.
And a pleasure to see both of you again,
she looked between Blaine and Ash.
It's really Sabrina,
May whispered in a rush, eyes growing even brighter as she held her hands in front of her chest and stared at Sabrina.
I'm standing by the Sabrina Natsum. Pinch me.
Her hand snapped out and grabbed Ash's arm, eye contact with the other woman unflinching.
Keep your tricks to yourself, woman,
Blaine stated gruffly.
I don't want your brain anywhere near mine.
He went on to mutter something in a language Ash didn't understand.
I have no desire to pick your thoughts.
Sabrina turned away from the scientist and faced Ash.
Your timing is a bit off,
she said, motioning for the group to follow her.
The Elite Four, those coming at least, arrived some hours ago. Most of the other gym leaders of Kanto are here as well. I've been entertaining them since they arrived.
She led the 3 trainers down the stairwell and out onto the gym's first floor, now well lit by chandeliers and ornamented wall fixtures that accented the tastefully extravagant decor.
But to be honest, my patience as a hostess was wearing out until I sensed more guests expecting us.
Ash asked. Shaking her head, Sabrina stopped in front of a grand set of double doors.
I couldn't sense you.
She paused and looked over at May.
Or your friend,
she added, looking back at Ash.
But I felt Blaine was on his way, so I anticipated Giovanni making his appearance. Speaking of...
She again stopped and folded her arms in front of her chest.
Is there any particular reason he decided not to come to the meeting he called?
Ash shrugged as May and Blaine stood by.
He mentioned not wanting to be seen by all of the other gym leaders. Said it would be bad for the Elite Four's image. That sounds like him,
Sabrina nodded slowly,
but from how he constantly talked about wanting to see you again, I'm surprised he'd throw you to the wolves like this.
Raising an eyebrow, Ash turned to May and the gym leader from Cinnabar.
Why don't you two go on in,
he said, waiting until both had agreed and stepped through the large doors, shutting it behind them, before he looked back to Sabrina.
What are you talking about?
He asked, tone growing deathly cold.
Define throwing me to the wolves. Well,
Sabrina began, her oddly colored eyes locking on his.
Lance and Agatha are both in there,
she said.
Lance is usually the reasonable sort, but his cousin is dead and from what I understand, Team Rocket has been running a lot of operations he didn't sanction. Giovanni was supposed to explain all that.
Fuck, Ash shook his head and put one hand over his eyes.
I should have known. I'd regret even thinking about trusting him. So Team Rocket really is working for the Elite Four? And you knew?
He changed subjects. Sabrina nodded, face remaining unreadable.
I couldn't not know.
She reached up and tapped her forehead.
I can't turn off being psychic. But, Team Rocket, and by extension the Elite Four, and by extension myself and all of Kanto gain more from my not saying anything or exposing anyone. And yes.
She smiled.
I knew all that when I told you that a lot of people in Team Rocket are good people working for a bad organization. I just omitted the part about Team Rocket being a bad organization with, mostly, acceptable motives. I thought you couldn't read my mind,
Ash muttered.
Come on,
Sabrina said, putting a hand on his shoulder.
You don't want to keep them waiting. On the positive side, you're just the messenger, so Lance probably won't hold you responsible. Probably.
Ash muttered with a grin, turning as the door beside him flickered purple and swung inwards.
Even I can't promise more than that,
a feline grin spread on Sabrina's lips. Stepping into what appeared to Ash to be a comfortably furnished conference room, the psychic and the savant immediately drew the attention of the many people sitting around the circular table in the center of the room and all conversation ceased. Spotting Brock immediately, Ash felt a pang of unease as he recalled his most recent interaction with the gym leader from Pewter. Next to Brock, looking far more weathered than he remembered her, Kasumi leaned back in her chair with no shortage of stress evident on her face as she made eye contact with Ash. Erica, Blaine, and Mike the mercenary all nodded to the new arrival and, much to Ash's surprise, Vicky waved to him from the seat beside May, her frizzy red hair as unkempt as ever. Next to the trainer from Fuchsia, Bailey, and 2 of his engineers tipped their hard hats to their estranged boss. Scanning the faces in the room as he paused, Ash found only one he didn't immediately recognize, an old woman, sitting silently in the chair beside May and smiling at him with an expression in her aged eyes Ash couldn't place. As she stood up, realization dawned on Ash's features.
Good to see you again,
Agatha clapped her hands together once as she approached Ash.
It's been some time, child.
She stopped in front of him and looked him over.
Perhaps you don't remember me. Lavender,
Ash toned.
Though you never did tell me your name.
The young gym leader recovered from the surprise and folded his arms in front of his chest.
I'd hazard to guess that you're Agatha, though. It's nice to finally meet you.
He inclined his head, again.
Likewise,
said the old woman genially, though her attention seemed to be elsewhere as she focused on Ash's forehead, then glanced quickly between him and May as Sabrina rounded the table and took a seat beside Brock.
Well, if everyone's here, then I'd best retrieve Lance.
She turned towards a tall but otherwise inconspicuous door opposite the conference room's entrance before Ash interrupted her.
Actually,
said the young gym leader, stepping beside Agatha,
is it possible I can have a moment alone with him? There are a few things I believe I'm supposed to explain in private.
He paused as Agatha turned back to him without a smile.
In reference to a mutual acquaintance,
Ash went on. Her black eyes narrowing, Agatha studied him for a second, before shrugging and turning back to the door.
Of course, child,
she said with an air of ease about her.
You know more than I, it seems.
With a quiet sigh, Ash pushed his shoulders back and followed Agatha to the smaller door as the rest of the room's occupants began muttering amongst themselves, some curious, others obviously uneasy. Only Brock and Sabrina, Ash would have seen if he had turned around, retained their statuesque calm. Stopping in front of the door, Ash put his hand on the knob, and thought briefly about knocking. Without doing so, he pulled it open and stepped through, into the small office beyond. Lit by dying sunlight streaming through a single window in the western wall, the room stood empty of any furnishing beyond a desk in the center, flanked on either side by a chair. A single humanoid figure, a black silhouette in the orange pane of the window, cast a smothering shadow that seemed to cut the room in half and obscured Ash's entire frame in its darkness. Turning around as the door clicked shut behind Ash, the towering figure crossed its arms, but remained otherwise unmoving and silent. The instant the door shut, Ash shivered, his skin going cold and a sweat breaking out on his forehead. His hands instinctively clenched as the faintest odor of smoke and sulfur hit his nose and tongue. He saw rising low over the silhouette's head, arching down the back of the man's neck, what looked like a pair of long, barbed horns. Short spikes rose from the figure's shoulders and knife-like protrusions stuck out from its elbows. The young trainer could see, as his eyes began to adjust to the light, that the tips of the man's fingers ended in what Ash could only guess to be talons, extending well beyond the length any human nail could reach.
"Lance?"
Ash asked, his voice shaking noticeably as he gazed at the inhuman silhouette. His eyes adjusting further, Ash spotted a pair of eyes composed of sharp angles and narrowing as they studied him. His stomach sank as a dread he hadn't felt since lavender washed over him.
"You are not Giovanni,"
Lance's smooth but rumbling voice filled the small room. The man stepped out from in front of the window, allowing Ash's eyes to adjust to the contrast. What Ash had thought to be the traits of a monster he could now make out in the friendlier light. Lance in fact had no horns, but rather a great mane of fiery hair that spiked back and downward in two thick arcs. He wore a segmented suit of black armor that bore numerous metal spikes across its surface, most notably at the wrists and elbows, and a pair of gloves whose digits extended outwards like the claws of a dragon and ended in razor-sharp points. Still however, Ash remained unable to find his voice, having to look up at the trainer who towered well over 7, and approached 8 feet tall and filled the room with an air of numbing dread.
"Since you are not Giovanni,"
Lance said,
"do you mean to speak on his behalf?"
Nodding quickly as he visibly shook and straightened up, Ash faced the other trainer, but remained where he stood.
Yes I do,"
he said, pausing for a moment thereafter and reaching into his vest. He produced the crystalline earth badge, which drew Lance's momentary but undivided attention as it flickered in the light.
"Well, speak then,"
Lance's voice already carried an edge of impatience. Clearing his throat and putting away the badge, Ash took a steadying breath but remained quick to shake whenever the other trainer so much as blinked. Making his best effort to speak evenly, Ash began to relate all the information he knew about Mewtwo's development at Team Rocket's hand and his current activities in Malbolge. Lance listened in absolute silence, his eyes never shifting from the young trainer as Ash told the story and made his case for Mewtwo being the mastermind behind Johto's, Oars, and the Orange Island's current maneuverings against Cinnabar and Kanto.
"And he, Giovanni I mean,"
Ash began wrapping up his hastily delivered speech,
"that you would be willing to take a contingent of troops to Cinnabar to deal with the threats there."
"So," Lance's voice rumbled.
"Team Rocket means to move the Elite Four away from Indigo, to the other side of the continent, while they, I dare to presume, will attempt to deal with the problem they created, underestimated, and failed to contain."
He paused and looked at Ash.
"Well, why shouldn't I just go deal with Mewtwo myself, and take whatever this treasure it guards happens to be?"
He smirked, revealing teeth almost too perfectly white, as Ash flinched.
"I don't know what treasure you're..."
Ash trailed off, abandoning the lie.
"Do you think I'm a fool?"
The leader of the Elite Four went on when Ash remained silent.
"I've always known Team Rocket had ulterior motives, and that they've always been too loyal and too quick to express their loyalty to be genuine. Then one day they start going off the grid and performing unsanctioned operations just as all hell breaks loose in the world. I know Giovanni is nearing the completion of his plan. What that might be, however, I can't guess, and you would be a fool to imagine that you fully understand his intentions. So I'll ask you again, why shouldn't I?"
Freezing in place and looking at the door, Lance cut himself off as both he and Ash jumped at the sound of a low hum. The din quickly rose in intensity until it rumbled through the room from the closed door at Ash's back. The leader of the Elite Four unfolded his arms and stepped forward, prompting Ash to immediately move to one side. Pulling the door open and stepping through, Lance and Ash found themselves in the darkened conference room. All of the lights hanging from the ceiling and fixed to the walls having gone out, the only source of illumination was a massive red figure, seemingly composed of glowing and translucent glass, standing on the table in the room's center. Lance's gaze immediately locked on the humanoid hologram at the center of the room, while Ash glanced about the other gym leaders. He tried to understand why they all sat still and stiff in their chairs, staring at the hologram, until he looked at May and spotted her looking between him and Lance. The girl in the tank top quickly hopped to her feet, seemingly unnoticed as she moved to Ash's side. Its long tail flicking from one side to another as its head turned to look between all those present, the hologram radiated a sense of dread that Ash could sense resonating in everyone in the room save himself and May. As the gym leaders, Lance and Agatha stared at the red figure, it gradually took on clearer and clearer definition, growing to resemble a man standing on two strong legs, balancing on a thick tail and possessing hands that each sported 3 dexterous fingers. A thick column of tubes that looked more like a bundle of wire than any organic formation ran from the center of the hologram's spine to the back of its elongated head.
Is this all?
A ringing voice echoed throughout the room as the hologram glowed slightly brighter.
Is this all the more you can muster to save yourselves?
Stopping for a second and facing everyone in the room with the exception of Ash and May, the hologram's beady eyes came to rest finally on Lance.
Weakling,
its voice rang again.
Failed leader of a failed species. Know that on your watch that the Elite Four fell. By your impotence and inability, by your ignorance, the reign of man is ending.
It stopped and again turned its gaze on the other gym leaders.
I am Mewtwo. You can surrender and serve, or you can die. You have no other options.
His eyes lighting up with indignation, Ash stepped forward, between Lance and Mewtwo's avatar.
I've got another option for you,
Ash shouted at the hologram, instantly drawing its attention. He cast about for a split second, noting immediately that whatever spell held the other gym leaders in a powerless trance had broken and they all looked intently to him now.
I'm going to come for you, and I'm going to stop you. You're nothing but an abomination, a fluke of science, a dead end. I don't know if you've forgotten, Mewtwo.
Ash stared directly at the avatar's burning eyes.
But man made you, and man can just as easily unmake you.
The room went silent for several long seconds.
Hollow words,
the image answered.
You threaten to resist because your simple human mind cannot fathom the true cost of doing so. What you do not know is that your defenses are already swept away, and your cities are already burning.
The hologram paused and looked at the conference room's double doors.
You will learn in just a moment now that you have already lost.
Fading from view after a second's pause, Mewtwo's avatar disappeared and the lights slowly came back on, their soft humming the only sound in the room. For a short time everyone only looked around at one another, before everyone's gaze fell on Ash. Getting to her feet, Kasumi spoke first.
What the hell was that?
She barked.
I came here to discuss Cerulean's claim over Mount Moon, not sit through whatever the hell that was. As Empress of Celadon and the surrounding lands,
Erika stood up and faced Ash.
I demand an explanation for this indignity. Cerulean's claim.
Brock growled, bolting up and glaring at Kasumi.
Don't you think we have bigger problems? Shut your mouth,
Kasumi whirled on Brock.
I won't stand for you distracting from the rightful discussion here. The rightful discussion,
Blaine stood up, as did everyone else in the room at that point,
can only be what is to be done about Mewtwo and Johto. I'm still waiting for my explanation.
Erika glared at Ash as the rest of the gym leaders began shouting at each other, making demands of Ash, or turning to Agatha and Lance to take control of the situation.
That is enough.
Lance shouted, stomping his foot on the ground and filling the room with a tremendous boom.
Now everyone.
He looked over the gathered gym leaders.
All.
The huge man stopped short as the room's doors burst open and a man arrayed in purple with a red sash ran inside.
Sorry to interrupt,
shouted the new arrival at the same time Ash recognized him as Koga.
Sorry, I just need a minute to speak.
A second later 2 of Sabrina's guards ran in after Koga and turned to their employer.
We're sorry, ma'am,
said the shorter guard.
He ran right past us. Take your time, Koga.
Agatha stepped up next to the man and put a hand on his shoulder.
What's the matter? Out of my way, out of my way,
a booming voice echoed in the hall outside as a muscled man in white shorts stomped past 2 more guards and entered the room.
Move, I must speak.
He shoved his way past Koga and turned to Lance.
Sir,
he inclined his head. Confusion flitting through his eyes, Lance looked at the shirtless new arrival and motioned to him.
Bruno,
asked the leader of the Elite Four.
What are you doing here?
Koga stepped forward, ignoring Ash and positioning himself in front of Lance.
Sir, forgive my interruption, but I have dire news from Cerulean. Sir,
he said, barely pausing between words and dropping to one knee.
Sir, the city came under attack 5 days ago. A horde of monsters stormed out of Cerulean Cave and completely destroyed Team Rocket's defenses. It was obvious there was nothing anyone could do to stop them, so I ordered my men and the Cerulean Gym to evacuate the civilians to the rocket fortress in Mount Moon while I came straight here to warn you. Sir, Cerulean's gone. What?
Kasumi screamed.
How's that possible?
Pushing forward, Bruno knelt by Koga and inclined his head to Lance.
My lord, the same news from Indigo.
He looked up and steeled himself as anger began to show on Lance's face.
The day before yesterday, an army of Pokémon attacked from Malbolge. A ranger warned they were coming and we tried to fight at first, but there were too many. They demolished our defenses and began moving east. I flew here to warn you, and Lorelei took what remained of the guard and flew to Viridian to raise the alarm, with plans to go next to Pewter.
Without answering, Lance looked between the gym leaders as an anxious silence spread over the room. After a moment, he turned to Ash.
All right,
said the towering man,
you've convinced me that Mewtwo is the real threat. Does our mutual friend have a plan to stop him? Actually yes,
Ash nodded.
He was going to meet May and I at the Indigo entrance to Malbolge and from there the three of us were going to go after Mewtwo. Then Agatha and I will be going with you.
Lance clenched his fists. Shaking his head, Ash looked at the towering man.
Believe me, I wish you could help, but you really can't. It's something May, Giovanni, and I have to do ourselves.
Ash didn't notice as Brock raised an eyebrow from where he stood upon hearing Giovanni's name.
Really?
Lance muttered.
And why is that?
Sabrina cleared her throat and stepped forward.
He's telling you the truth, said the woman. You'll remember that just now Mewtwo paralyzed us all for his declaration of war. Only May and Ash were free of his influence. Mewtwo's a psychic whose power dwarfs even mine, and these two.
She gestured to the pair of trainers beside her.
Are some of the only people in the world able to shrug off a psychic's power. If you or I moved against Mewtwo.
Sabrina trailed off.
Shall we say it would end badly for us?
Turning and watching Ash and May for a moment, Lance sighed and folded his arms in front of his chest.
Fine,
he said, shrugging his shoulders.
If that's how it is, that's how it is.
Holding his arms out at his sides, Lance stepped back and faced everyone in the room.
Everyone, I know it's been a hard day, but we're not going to let this get the best of us. If this little bitch thinks he's big enough to play in our league, we're going to show him that we can take a hell of a lot more than the one cowardly sucker punch he threw at us. Sabrina,
he turned to the psychic,
get Ash and May outfitted for a trip to hell and back. And you too.
He looked at the two savants.
As soon as you've got your gear ready, get down there and kill that bastard. As for the rest of us, we've got work to do. Cinnabar still needs help and Mewtwo's invading on two fronts. Sir,
Brock stepped forward.
From Indigo he can really only hit Viridian, and from there, Pewter is the next clear target. If Lorelei's evacuating Viridian to Pewter then it's most logical to fall back from there to Team Rocket's fortress in Mount Moon, but we're going to need to arm that place to the teeth since Mewtwo could hit it from Cerulean and Viridian and then march on Saffron with the combined force. I volunteer to lead the defense in Mount Moon. Bold,
Lance nodded.
I like it. Take Bruno and Koga with you.
He looked to Erika.
You'll send your troops here, in case Mewtwo decides to split his forces and hit Saffron and Mount Moon simultaneously. He seems to like that strategy.
Animosity played in Erika's face for a second, though she inclined her head.
Of course, sir. Mike.
She turned to the man beside her.
You'll head up the operation. Ma'am,
Mike acknowledged.
You,
Lance turned to Bailey.
You're going to Vermilion to call reinforcements to Saffron. Clear.
Removing his hat and nodding, Bailey agreed to the order and immediately began conversing with his two subordinates as Lance declared that everyone had their orders and it was time to get moving on them.
Sir,
Ash motioned for Lance's attention.
Will you be going to Cinnabar, then?
With a gruff sigh, Lance turned back to Ash.
Yes, Blaine and I will be going to Cinnabar to deal with the invasion on that front. Listen, I don't know what you know about Giovanni.
Lance turned his back on the rest of the room and spoke more softly.
But you need to know that he's not anyone's ally but his own. I've worked with him all these years because he normally gets damn good results, but I've never for a second trusted him. I'm willing to go along with his plan for now because I doubt Mewtwo's victory in his best interest, but I likewise doubt he much cares who survives this confrontation as long as Mewtwo does not. I'm starting to get that feeling,
Ash muttered, resisting the urge to bite his lip and berate himself for wanting so badly to believe Giovanni had been genuine.
I could be wrong,
the towering man shrugged.
Maybe I am. Do what you will. By the way, I'll send Agatha to escort you as far as my complex in Indigo.
His tone dropped and he grew deadly serious again, making Ash twitch.
Just get into Malbolge and kill this son of a bitch.
Ash nodded.
I can do that. Good.
Lance stepped back and turned, motioned for Blaine, and left the conference room with the Cinnabarian gym leader in tow. Ash sighed and closed his eyes, putting one hand on his forehead and trying to get his thoughts clear.
So,
the voice made Ash jump and turn, spotting Brock behind him.
Long time no see. You've been busy.
His heart sinking, Ash turned and faced his old friend.
Yeah,
he said.
I have. How are you holding up?
End of chapter.